I mean, there are only so many schemes you can do. So I think for us, it's just being more.
Only so many schemes you could do.
Stephanie White just sat at a podium in front of cameras, with Caitlin Clark right beside her, and delivered one of the most catastrophically inadequate post-game press conferences this franchise has ever produced. And Caitlin Clark's face told you everything the official statement refused to. This is Rim Run, and today we are ripping the doors off the Indiana Fever's 2-minute cover-up and documenting exactly what that body language means for the future of this franchise.
The first half was playing transition, spray, find open people, and then it's really hard to do that when all we do is foul and they score. Like, we didn't play in transition at all in the second half because of that.
Let me be entirely clear with you from the jump. What we witnessed in that post-game press conference was not a minor communication hiccup. It was not a tired coach giving a short answer after a long night. What we witnessed was an institution, the Indiana Fever front office, the coaching staff, and everyone in that building who signed off on releasing a 2-minute and 34-second press conference to the public, collectively deciding that Caitlin Clark, and by extension every single person watching this video, did not deserve a real explanation. They scored 101 points. 101. You should be able to win a basketball game when you score 101 points. Stephanie White said that herself, and yet the Fever lost. And the entire post-game media availability lasted 2 minutes and 34 seconds. 2 minutes, 34 seconds. That is the duration of accountability the Indiana Fever front office decided this situation warranted. That is the respect they showed the media, the fan base, and most damningly, the most important player this franchise has ever had sitting right next to the head coach while she gave those answers. Now I want every single person watching this video to understand the scope of what we are actually discussing here. This is not a story about one bad game. This is not a story about a team that had a rough night and needs to clean some things up. This is a story about a structural failure, a glaring, undeniable, baffling structural failure that is playing out in real time, in public, with Caitlin Clark absorbing every consequence, while the people responsible for fixing it give 2-minute press conferences and walk out of the room. The evidence has been building. The receipts are sitting right in front of us, and today we are going to go through every single one of them. Because the conversation that television refuses to have is the one that actually explains what is happening to this team.
When they went on that run in the third, we became a little disconnected, and so we weren't as active, we weren't as aware, we weren't anticipating as much, and we just got to find ways to...
Let us start with the game itself, because the numbers from that press conference are genuinely alarming when you stack them together. Stephanie White acknowledged that the opponent had somewhere between 17 and 20 fast break points in that loss. 17 to 20. Fast break points. Those are not contested half-court buckets. Those are not tough pull-up jumpers that a great player hit in a difficult moment. Fast break points are the direct result of turnovers and transition defense failures. They are the most preventable category of points in basketball. When you give up 17 to 20 of them in a single game, you are not losing because the other team was better. You are losing because your team is making catastrophic, self-inflicted mistakes that put the opponent at a structural advantage before the shot clock even starts. Stephanie White said it herself. Those are easy buckets where you are playing at an advantage. And the turnovers that fed those fast break points? 9 turnovers. The Fever had 9 turnovers in that game, and the opponent converted 11 points directly off of them. 11 points off 9 turnovers, plus 17 to 20 fast break points. That is a combined damage figure of somewhere between 28 and 31 points that the Fever essentially handed to the other team. 28 to 31 points, in a game they lost. In a game where they scored 101 points and still could not win. Let that number sink in for a second. You scored 101 points, you gave away somewhere between 28 and 31 more, and you still lost. That is the mathematical portrait of a team that is beating itself. And the head coach's response to that mathematical portrait was a 2-minute and 34-second press conference. Now here is where it gets truly revealing. Stephanie White was asked directly about the foul trouble that has been plaguing the Fever's key players across multiple recent games. She was asked whether the foul numbers were correctable on Indiana's end, or whether it was a product of how the game was being called. And her answer was a masterclass in saying nothing while appearing to say something. She acknowledged that there has been a league-wide emphasis on freedom of movement fouls, that foul totals have gone up across the board. Fine, that is a real thing. But then she pivoted immediately to the idea that the Fever individually have things they can do to be less vulnerable, and collectively have things they can do to have each other's back. Which sounds responsible, which sounds like a coach taking ownership. Except it is not, because it is the exact same answer she has been giving, framed in the exact same diplomatic non-language, while the foul trouble has continued to mount and the losses have continued to pile up. She is not describing a solution. She is describing an awareness of the problem while providing zero tactical specificity about how to address it. And then a reporter asked the most important follow-up question of the entire press conference. How does the foul situation change how you scheme defensively? And here is where Stephanie White delivered the single most devastating accidental admission of the entire night. Do not take my word for it. Here is exactly what she said in her own words, with cameras rolling.
There are only so many schemes you can do. So I think for us, it's just being more intense.
Only so many schemes you could do.
She said it, with cameras rolling, in a post-game press conference. There are only so many schemes you can do. That is the head coach of the Indiana Fever, the team that has Caitlin Clark, the most talked about, most watched, most commercially significant player in the history of this league, sitting next to her at that podium, telling the media that her defensive options are structurally limited. There are only so many schemes you can do. That is not a coaching answer. That is a surrender statement dressed up in professional language. That is a head coach publicly acknowledging that she has run out of tactical responses to a problem that has been documented across multiple consecutive games, and doing so in 2 minutes and 34 seconds before walking out of the room. Let me say it back to you so you do not miss it. The head coach of the Indiana Fever told the media, on camera, that there are only so many schemes available to her. That is the admission. That is the evidence. That is what Caitlin Clark was sitting next to.
The first half was playing transition, spray, find open people, and then it's really hard to do that when all we do is foul and they score. Like, we didn't play in transition at all in the second half because of that.
Now I want to talk about the pattern here, because this is not the first time this has happened. This is not an isolated bad night with an isolated bad press conference. This is a recurring, undeniable, soul-crushing pattern that has been playing out across this entire stretch of the season, and the people who run this franchise have been content to let it continue while Caitlin Clark absorbs every single consequence of it. Think about what Stephanie White described when she was asked about the third quarter collapse. She said the team became disconnected. She said they were not as active, not as aware, not anticipating as much. Those are coaching words for a team that lost its identity in the most critical period of a game. The third quarter is where basketball games are decided at the professional level. Every serious analyst, every serious coach, every serious player in this league understands that the third quarter is where you either assert your will or you surrender the momentum. And the Indiana Fever, in a game where they scored 101 points and still lost, went into the third quarter and became disconnected, not physically broken down, not out-talented, disconnected. That is a preparation failure. That is a coaching failure. That is a scheme and communication failure that starts on the bench, not on the floor. And here is the part that the establishment does not want you to sit with. Caitlin Clark had a genuinely strong first half in that game. The reporter acknowledged it directly. Clark was asked what changed in the third period, and she gave the most honest, most accountable answer of the entire press conference. She said she needs to take care of the ball better, and that starts with her. She took personal accountability. She pointed the finger at herself first. That is the character of the player we are watching. And then she described exactly what the Fever did well in the first half. They spread the floor, they found open people, they played in transition. And then she said something that should have stopped every single person in that room cold. She said it was really hard to do that when all you do is foul and the other team scores. She said the Fever did not play in transition at all in the second half because of the foul trouble. Not at all. The entire offensive system that made the first half functional, gone, eliminated, not because the other team took it away, because the Fever's own foul discipline destroyed it from the inside. Now I want you to understand what that means structurally. Caitlin Clark is a transition offense player. Her greatest weapon, the weapon that makes her genuinely terrifying to defend at every level she has ever played, is her ability to push pace, to find open players ahead of the defense, to operate at a speed that the opponent cannot match. That is who she is, that is how she wins. And in the second half of a game the Fever lost, that weapon was completely neutralized. Not by the defense, by the Fever's own foul trouble, by a team that could not maintain the discipline necessary to keep the transition game alive. And the head coach's response to that was 2 minutes and 34 seconds. Let me be entirely clear about what the pattern looks like from the outside, because the people who run this league and the people who cover it on television are actively choosing not to connect these dots. The Fever, have a player who scored 101 points worth of offense as a team in a game they lost. They have a player who is publicly, on camera, diagnosing the exact tactical problem that cost them the second half. They have a player who is taking personal accountability for her own role in the turnover problem, while simultaneously identifying the systemic foul issue as the thing that broke the offensive structure. Caitlin Clark is doing the head coach's press conference job better than the head coach is doing it. And she is doing it while sitting next to a coach who just told the media there are only so many schemes available to her. That is the brutal reality of what we watched in that room.
When they went on that run in the third, we became a little disconnected, and so we weren't as active, we weren't as aware, we weren't anticipating as much, and we've just got to find ways to.
Now I want to talk about the 47 points. Because Stephanie White mentioned 47 points in her press conference answer, and I do not want that number to get buried. She said that between fouls and turnovers, the Fever were giving up 47 points. 47. Let me say that again. 47 points between fouls and turnovers. In a game they scored 101 points and still lost. That means if you remove the self-inflicted damage, the turnovers, the foul-generated free throws, the Fever's actual competitive basketball, the basketball they played when they were executing, was dominant. The first half was dominant. Caitlin Clark was dominant. The system, when it was allowed to breathe, was working. The problem was never the talent on the floor. The problem was never Caitlin Clark. The problem was the inability to maintain the discipline and the structural integrity of the game plan across 40 minutes. And that is a coaching problem. That is a preparation problem. That is a Stephanie White problem. And this is the part that makes the 2-minute and 34-second press conference so absolutely catastrophically unacceptable. When you have given up 47 points between fouls and turnovers in a game you lost, the media deserves a real explanation. The fan base deserves a real explanation. Caitlin Clark deserves a real explanation. Not a 2-minute and 34-second appearance where the head coach tells reporters there are only so many schemes and then walks out of the room. That is not accountability. That is avoidance dressed up in a professional setting. And I want to talk about the body language in that room, because it is the detail that the official press release cannot spin away. Caitlin Clark was sitting right next to Stephanie White during that entire press conference, right next to her. And anyone who watched that footage, anyone who looked at Clark's face during those answers, during those 2 minutes and 34 seconds of diplomatic non-language and structural deflection, knows that what they saw was not a player who felt supported by her head coach. What they saw was not a player who felt like the person sitting next to her had a plan. What they saw was a player who was visibly, unmistakably, agonizingly frustrated. Not at the media, not at the opponent, at the situation she is being asked to navigate every single night while the people around her give 2-minute press conferences and talk about there being only so many schemes. And here is what makes that body language so significant. Caitlin Clark is not a dramatic player. She is not a player who performs frustration for the cameras. She is a player who takes personal accountability in press conferences, who points the finger at herself first, who describes the tactical problem with more clarity and more honesty than the head coach sitting right next to her. When a player of that character, with that level of professionalism and that level of accountability, is visibly frustrated sitting next to her head coach in a post-game press conference, that is not a small thing. That is a signal. That is a signal that the disconnect between what is happening on the floor and what is being communicated from the bench has reached a level that can no longer be contained behind professional language and 2-minute press conferences. Now here is the second receipt, and this one is even more damning than the first, because it comes from Caitlin Clark herself. The reporter asked her directly about the second half, and she gave an answer that Stephanie White should have been forced to respond to on camera. Here is what Caitlin Clark said, in her own words, about what happened in the second half of that game. Let me say it back to you so you do not miss it. Caitlin Clark said, on camera in a post-game press conference, that it is really hard to spread the floor and find open people, the things the Fever did well in the first half, when all you do is foul and the opponent scores. She said the Fever did not play in transition at all in the second half because of that. Not at all. That is the player. That is the most important player in this franchise's history, sitting at a podium next to her head coach, describing in real time how the coaching staff's inability to solve the foul problem destroyed the offensive system that was working. And Stephanie White was sitting right there, and the total media availability lasted 2 minutes and 34 seconds. There is no spin to put on that, none. Now let us talk about what this actually means going forward, because the verdict on this situation is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. It is brutal. It is the kind of thing that the people who run this franchise desperately do not want the conversation to arrive at. But it is unavoidable, and I am going to say it clearly. Stephanie White is in an untenable position, not because she is a bad person, not because she does not understand basketball, but because the gap between what this roster needs, specifically what Caitlin Clark needs in terms of tactical development, foul management, and second-half execution, and what the current coaching staff has been able to deliver, has now been documented publicly, on camera, in the words of the head coach herself. There are only so many schemes you can do. That is the quote. That is the self-indictment, when a head coach publicly acknowledges that her tactical options are exhausted in response to a specific recurring problem, and that problem continues to cost games. The question of job security is no longer a controversial one. It is a mathematical one. And here is the prediction I am putting on the record right now, because the evidence demands it. If the Indiana Fever front office does not make a substantive change to the coaching structure before the end of this season, Caitlin Clark is going to make a decision about her future with this franchise. I am not saying that lightly. I am not saying it to generate controversy. I am saying it because the body language in that room, the words Caitlin Clark chose in that press conference, the way she diagnosed the problem with more precision and more honesty than the person sitting next to her, all of it points to a player who is running out of patience. And Caitlin Clark has options. Caitlin Clark will always have options. The Indiana Fever front office needs to understand that the window for getting this right is not infinite. It is not even particularly wide. And 2-minute and 34-second press conferences are not how you keep the most important player in your franchise's history invested in the building. The second prediction I am putting on the record is about the foul problem specifically. Stephanie White acknowledged that it is a combination of things: the league-wide emphasis on freedom of movement calls, and individual and collective habits that the Fever need to correct. Fine, but she has been acknowledging that combination for multiple games now, and the foul numbers have not come down. And the 47 points between fouls and turnovers have not come down. And the transition game in the second half, the Caitlin Clark weapon that makes this offense genuinely dangerous, has continued to be neutralized by the same recurring problem. At some point, acknowledging a problem without solving it stops being coaching and starts being a record of failure. The Fever are approaching that line if they have not already crossed it. The third prediction is about the press conference culture itself. What happened in that room? 2 minutes and 34 seconds. A head coach saying there are only so many schemes. A star player visibly frustrated while sitting right next to her. That footage does not disappear. It circulates. It gets clipped. It gets analyzed. It becomes the visual evidence that the conversation about this franchise's direction keeps returning to. The Indiana Fever front office made a decision, whether consciously or not, to release a 2-minute and 34-second press conference to the public after a loss in which their team gave up 47 points between fouls and turnovers and surrendered their entire transition offense in the second half. That decision has consequences. It tells the fan base that the people running this franchise do not believe they owe a full accounting of what went wrong. It tells the media that access and transparency are not priorities. And most importantly, it tells Caitlin Clark that the institutional support structure around her is not operating at the level her talent and her investment in this team deserve. Now I want to talk about what this situation looks like from Caitlin Clark's perspective, because I think the conversation has been too focused on the coaching staff and not focused enough on the player at the center of all of this. Caitlin Clark is doing everything right. She is taking personal accountability in press conferences. She is diagnosing tactical problems with surgical precision. She is identifying exactly what worked in the first half and exactly what broke down in the second half. And she is doing it with more clarity and more honesty than anyone else in that room. She is a player who, in a game her team lost, still contributed to a 101-point offensive output. She is a player who described the opponent's fast break advantage as self-inflicted, not a talent gap, not an insurmountable problem, but a correctable failure of discipline and execution. She is a player who is pointing the way forward every single time she opens her mouth in front of a microphone. And the people around her are giving 2-minute and 34-second press conferences and saying there are only so many schemes. That is the brutal, undeniable, agonizing reality of what we watched in that room. And the final clip I want to bring you, the one that nobody on television will play for you because of what it proves about the disconnect at the center of this franchise, is Stephanie White's answer about the third quarter collapse. Because it is the moment where the coach's language and the player's language are so far apart that you can actually measure the distance between them. Here is Stephanie White describing what went wrong in the third quarter. She said the team became a little disconnected. Not a lot disconnected. A little. In a quarter where the opponent went on a run that turned a competitive game into a deficit, the Fever spent the rest of the night trying to climb out of. A little disconnected. And then she said they were not as active, not as aware, not anticipating as much. Those are the words of a coach who is describing the symptoms of a problem without naming the cause. Caitlin Clark in the same press conference named the cause. The foul trouble killed the transition game. The transition game was the entire offensive identity of the first half. When it died, the team became disconnected. When the team became disconnected, they stopped anticipating. The cause and the effect are right there. Clark identified them. White described the effect and left the cause unnamed. That is the gap. That is the gap that is sitting in that room between those two people at that podium. And it is not a small gap. It is a glaring, catastrophic, undeniable gap between a player who understands what is happening and a coaching staff that is still speaking in symptoms while the disease keeps spreading. Caitlin Clark is not the problem with the Indiana Fever. Caitlin Clark is the solution that the Indiana Fever has not yet figured out how to build around. She is telling them in real time in public exactly what needs to change. She is taking personal accountability for her own role in the turnover problem, while simultaneously identifying the systemic failure that is costing the team its second-half identity. She is doing this while visibly, unmistakably frustrated, sitting next to a head coach who just told the media that there are only so many schemes, and she is doing it with the composure and the professionalism of a player who has not yet stopped believing that this situation can be fixed. But that belief has a shelf life, and the Indiana Fever front office, the coaching staff, and everyone in that building who signed off on a 2-minute and 34-second press conference needs to understand that the shelf life is not infinite. Right now, today, in this moment, Caitlin Clark is still in that building. She is still taking accountability. She is still pointing toward the solution. She is still the most important player in this franchise's history, sitting at a podium and telling the truth about what happened while the establishment around her chooses 2 minutes and 34 seconds of avoidance over a real accounting of the failure. That is where we are. That is the situation. And the clock is ticking on how long that remains the case. Here is the forced choice question I need you to answer in the comments right now, and I want you to be specific. Does Stephanie White survive the end of this season as the head coach of the Indiana Fever? Yes or no? And if yes, what does she have to change between now and the final game to justify keeping the job? Not a vague answer, not a general take. Yes or no, and what has to change? Drop it below. I want to read every single one. If this video gave you something the television broadcast did not, hit the notification bell right now so you are in the room the next time this franchise does something the establishment refuses to explain honestly. This is Rim Run. We will be here.